The night my mother died, the room felt like it had already given up on her. Portland Mercy's ICU was always cold, but that night the air felt like ice against my skin, sharp enough to keep me awake through the terror of knowing I was about to lose the only person who ever saw me, not the version my family dismissed, not the daughter they pushed aside, but me. The monitors beside her bed blinked weakly. Each beep came slower than the last, stretching into long, unbearable pauses that made my heart stop with them. No father, no sister, no brother, no buzzing phones, no footsteps rushing down the hall. I kept expecting anyone from the Rutherford family to burst through the door and say they were sorry that they were late, but here now, ready to stand beside her. But the hallway stayed empty. The silence was so complete, it almost hummed. My mother's hand went cold in mine as the screen faded to a single flat line, and the quiet felt like betrayal. Not hers, never hers, but theirs. And then Nurse Marie pressed a sealed envelope into my palm, her voice trembling. She made me swear to give this to you. Only you. Inside wasn't just a final goodbye. It was a list of names, a safe code, and the first spark of a truth that would unravel my entire family. I stayed there after the machines were turned off, unable to let go of her hand. Her skin felt fragile, lighter than paper. I traced the faint bruise where the IV had been taped and tried to memorize every detail: her stillness, the soft white wisps of her hair, the faint lavender scent she wore even to her doctor's appointments. It felt wrong that the world didn't stop for her, that outside this room, people were living their nights as if the greatest force in my life hadn't just vanished in one long, merciless breath. I leaned my forehead against her knuckles and whispered the same thing I'd been saying to her since childhood. I'm here, Mom. I'm right here. At some point, Nurse Marie dimmed the lights and stood quietly by the door. She waited for you, she said. She kept asking if you were coming. You were the only one she wanted. That sentence broke something in me. Not because it surprised me, but because I knew it was true. I was always the one who showed up, even when no one else did. I walked out into the waiting area with the envelope gripped so tightly my fingers ached. The hospital was nearly empty, the kind of empty that echoes. Someone had left a stack of outdated magazines on the coffee table, and a half-dead fern slumped in the corner. I sat down, my body suddenly shaking with the kind of exhaustion that goes deeper than bone. I stared at my phone. Still no messages from them. I thought about calling my father. Or Celeste. Or Damon. I even typed out the words, "Mom is gone," then deleted them. They didn't deserve to hear it from me. They hadn't even deserved her. The envelope sat in my lap like it had its own heartbeat. My name was written across the front in my mother's looping handwriting, but the letters were shaky, like her strength had faded as she wrote it. I slipped my finger under the seal and opened it slowly, afraid of what I'd find, and even more afraid of what I wouldn't. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded into thirds. When I opened it, the first thing I saw was a list of 5 names. Some I recognized, some I didn't. Next to a few were small stars drawn in red ink. Under the list was a line that made my throat tighten. Trust only those I marked. The others betrayed me. Beneath that, in smaller writing, she had added, "You'll need them when the time comes." Below the list was a tiny brass key, taped neatly beside a safe deposit box number. Box 1174A. I stared at it for a long time, feeling a cold, creeping realization spread through my body. This wasn't simply a keepsake. It was a map, a warning, evidence she hadn't trusted anyone else in our family to protect. I folded the letter again and held it to my chest. "What were you afraid of?" I whispered. The question felt too big for the silent room. As I sat there, memories slipped in, quiet at first, then flooding the empty space around me. Moments when my mother had tried to tell me something and stopped herself. Times she'd looked at me with worry instead of pride. The way she'd asked to see me alone more often these last few months. I realized something terrible. She had known this was coming. When my breathing steadied enough to stand, I walked back to her room. The nurses had already removed the monitors. I kissed her forehead, still warm, and told her I'd take care of everything. I didn't know what everything meant yet, but I felt it settle into my bones like a promise. Outside, the parking lot was nearly empty. The December air bit at my skin, sharp and wet, the kind of air that filled your lungs like ice water. My car felt too quiet. I sat behind the wheel, still shaking, still holding the envelope like it might disappear if I blinked too long. My phone finally lit up with a message, just one from Celeste. A single line, "Is Mom stable?" Not a question about how she was. Not a sign she cared enough to come. Just a request for information, the same way she asked her assistant for updates on a real estate deal. I didn't respond. On the drive home, Portland blurred through my tears. I passed one of our family's commercial buildings downtown, the Rutherford name glowing across the top floor. For decades, the city trusted us with its homes, its businesses, its future. But the truth was, my family had abandoned their own far more easily than they ever abandoned a project or a profit. When I pulled into my driveway, the house was dark. I walked inside and locked the door behind me, leaning against it as grief overtook the last of my strength. The silence here felt different, warmer than the hospital, but still suffocating. I placed the envelope on the kitchen table and turned on the small lamp in the corner. The soft yellow light landed on the paper like a spotlight. The list of names felt heavier now, as if each letter carried the weight of a secret I wasn't ready to face. I sank into a chair and whispered, "Why did you trust me with this?" The truth was, I already knew. I was the only one who hadn't been corrupted by the promise of the Rutherford Empire. I was the only one who had never betrayed her. I traced the 5 names with my fingertip, recognizing the first one, Martin Reyes, the former CFO who left under mysterious circumstances. He'd always been kind to me when I visited the office as a teenager. The second name I recognized was Judge Miriam O'Neill, an old friend of my mother's. The others, Patrick Lorne, Evelyn Shore, Elise Granger, were strangers to me. But the red stars beside some of the names sent a chill down my spine. My eyes drifted to the safe deposit key, taped neatly to the bottom. I knew what I had to do. Tomorrow morning I would go to Rosewood Financial Bank. Whatever was waiting in that box was the next step in understanding why my mother had died betrayed and alone. Why my family had vanished when she needed them most. Why she trusted me, the invisible daughter, with her final act. I rested my head on the table, the letter still open before me, and whispered into the quiet room, "I'll find the truth, Mom. I promise." And for the first time that night I felt something other than grief. I felt resolve. I drove through the waking streets of Portland the next morning, my mother's letter tucked inside my coat pocket, its edges warm against my chest from where I'd held it through half the night. Dawn settled low over the skyline in a pale gray haze, the kind that made everything look softer than it really was. As I passed the rows of buildings carrying the Rutherford name, Rutherford Plaza, Rutherford Court, the glass tower of our flagship commercial complex, I felt the same quiet ache pressing into me. These buildings had stood longer and stronger than most families do. But on the night my mother died, not one person from the family who owned half the district bothered to show up. I slowed at a red light outside the newest Rutherford development. A $50 million mixed-use complex my father bragged about like it was his 4th child. The massive banner hung across the scaffolding read, "A Legacy of Strength." I stared at it and swallowed the bitterness rising in my throat. Legacy. The same word they used every time they pushed me into the margins. The same word they used when they excluded me from meetings, decisions, and family photos. The same word that had cracked apart the moment I saw my mother's weak smile fade into silence. By the time I reached my neighborhood, the city had fully woken. Coffee shops filled with people on laptops. Dog walkers tugged at leashes. Commuters waited for buses. Life went on. Mine felt stuck between grief and the heavy certainty that my mother's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was the beginning of a reckoning. Inside my kitchen, I set her letter carefully on the counter and made coffee just to have something warm to hold. My hands still trembled from the night before. I walked to the small dining table and opened her envelope again, flattening her list of names, the safe deposit code, and the tiny brass key. Each item felt like a puzzle piece my mother had been assembling for years, waiting for the moment I was forced to see the picture clearly. The first name on the list, Martin Reyes, flickered in my memory, the former CFO who left suddenly 3 years ago. Rumors swirled back then, mismanagement, disagreements with my father, maybe even a nervous breakdown. But I remembered the way he'd always smiled at me kindly when I visited the office as a teenager, how he'd once told my mother that I inherited her good instincts. I always liked Martin. I wondered what he had seen or discovered that made my mother trust him enough to mark his name with a red star. The second name, Judge Miriam O'Neill, tugged at something deeper. My mother used to meet her for lunch every few months. She was sharp, poised, the kind of woman who spoke softly but had a presence that filled a room. I could picture her now in her navy suits and elegant scarves. What had she known? What role had she played in whatever truth my mother was protecting? The other names, Patrick Lorne, Evelyn Shore, Elise Granger, were a mystery. I didn't know why they mattered, but the stars next to 2 names told me enough. My mother had been choosing allies long before she ever wrote this letter. I leaned back in my chair, letting memories seep in, the ones I tried so hard to ignore over the years. My mother at Christmas 2 years ago, quietly slipping her chair beside me when Celeste placed me at the far end of the table. My mother at family meetings, watching silently as my father and siblings cut me off mid-sentence. My mother checking on me after every gathering as if she knew I was drowning in the shadow of the family name. She always knew. I stood and pulled my coat on, grabbing the letter and the safe deposit key. I didn't know exactly what was in that bank vault, but I knew it was the next step. Before leaving the house, I paused by the bookshelf, where a framed photo of my mother sat, a candid shot of her tending her garden, dirt under her fingernails, her eyes soft and bright. "I'm going," I whispered. "I'll find whatever you left for me." The drive to Rosewood Financial Bank took me past the neighborhoods where Rutherford homes stood in perfect uniformity, rows of houses, designed by the company's architects, all neat and symmetrical little monuments to control and order. I wondered how many people behind those doors knew the truth about the family behind the brand. Probably none. My father had spent his entire life building an image strong enough to outshine the rot in its foundation. My own childhood was built inside that image. I could still see Celeste, even at 10 years old, lifting her chin and mimicking my father's favorite phrase, "Rutherfords don't show weakness." She carried that line like a weapon everywhere she went. Damon echoed it years later, shouting at me when I cried after he humiliated me during a dinner at the country club. "Don't be soft, Ivy. You're embarrassing us." My father never corrected them. He only nodded as if their cruelty was proof they were strong leaders. And I learned how to shrink myself into the quiet corners of the room, into the edges of every family photo, into the background of every conversation. I told myself I didn't mind. But I did. It hurt more than any of them ever realized. My mother was the only one who saw it, the only one who cared enough to place a gentle hand on my back when they tore me down. She told me once, after a particularly brutal dinner, "There's more strength in kindness than in pride. Don't let them convince you otherwise." I didn't understand then how much she meant it. Now I did. When I parked in front of Rosewood Financial, I stared at the bank's stone pillars for a long moment. Safe. Impenetrable. The kind of place you trusted with your most important secrets. I stepped inside, the air cool and quiet, and approached the front desk. The bank manager, a polished man in a gray suit, greeted me with a professional smile. But the moment I handed him my ID and the key, something shifted in his expression. "Ah," he said softly. "Miss Rutherford, your mother told us you'd come one day." My hands tightened around the strap of my bag. That sentence confirmed everything I feared and everything I needed. She'd planned this. She'd known I'd be the only one left standing in her place. The manager led me past the lobby down a private corridor lined with steel doors. Each step echoed the sound bouncing off the cold walls. With every echo, I felt my heartbeat rise. He stopped at a door marked 1174. A inserted a key of his own and gestured for me to do the same. "Take your time," he said gently. "Some things in these boxes are heavier than others." I nodded and pulled the metal drawer open. It slid out smoothly, revealing a simple black folder, a second sealed envelope, and a leather-bound notebook tied with twine. My breath caught. My mother's handwriting covered every visible surface. I sat in the small booth. The manager offered shut the door behind me and stared at the contents. My mother had chosen every item carefully. Each piece felt like a breadcrumb leading me somewhere I wasn't sure I wanted to go. But I couldn't stop now. I touched the notebook first. The leather was worn softer at the corners, the way something becomes after years of use. I knew immediately that this was her personal log, the one she never let out of her sight. The thought made my chest tighten. The second envelope was labeled, "For Ivy's eyes only." My hands shook as I lifted it, too afraid to open it here, but too desperate not to. I set it aside for the moment and pulled the black folder toward me. Inside were copies of documents, financial statements, property transfers, shareholder notes. I didn't know what any of it meant yet, but I knew it wasn't good. I recognized my father's signature on some pages, Damon's handwriting on others. Celeste's initials scrawled across more. My stomach sank. Whatever my mother feared, it was here. I looked at the list of names again. Martin Reyes, Judge O'Neill, and 3 others. My mother hadn't just left me evidence, she'd left me allies. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling over the table. "Okay," I whispered. "I'll follow where you lead." I closed the folder, gathered the notebook, the envelope, and the documents, and walked out of the vault with my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't know that by the end of the day, everything I believed about my family would be shattered. I only knew that my mother trusted me with the truth. And I wasn't going to let her down. The ornament always caught the morning light. A small glass sphere, painted with tiny silver leaves and flecks of gold, the one my mother bought during a Christmas market trip years ago. I was reaching for coffee when my elbow brushed it, sending it gently spinning on its hook. The soft swirl of gold and silver hit me like a punch. Suddenly, I was back inside the Rutherford Hills mansion 2 years earlier, standing in the doorway, while the warmth and color of Christmas wrapped around a night I've never forgotten. On the surface, that Christmas Eve looked perfect. The mansion glowed with thousands of white lights, garlands wrapped every staircase, the smell of pine and cinnamon drifted through the rooms. My father had hired a private choir to greet guests at the entrance. Caterers in crisp uniforms passed champagne on silver trays. Celeste had curated the decorations herself, making sure everything looked expensive enough to impress the Portland elite. I slipped in quietly. No one noticed at first. I wasn't dressed like them. No shimmering gown, no designer coat, just a simple burgundy dress I'd found on Discount One. My mother said looked beautiful on me. As I walked deeper into the house, conversations continued without pause. Laughter rose like a rehearsed soundtrack. This was easily the happiest night of the year for the Rutherfords, everyone celebrating themselves, their accomplishments, their empire. Everyone except my mother, who sat silently on a velvet sofa, pale and exhausted under layers of makeup. Celeste spotted me eventually and floated over with a smile so polished it could have been made of glass. "Oh, Ivy, you made it. I didn't think your schedule allowed for festive events." "I had time," I said quietly. "How lovely," she said, her eyes already sliding past me for someone more important. Before I could respond, Damon brushed by giving me a single glance before leaning toward a cousin and whispering just loud enough, "Did she take PTO from her little nonprofit for this?" A ripple of amused smirks spread across the group. I had been home for less than 3 minutes. When it was time for dinner, Celeste led the procession toward the long banquet table. It stretched down the great room lined with white linens, crystal glasses, and name cards in gold ink. I scanned the table, instinctively searching for my place. My stomach sank when I found it tucked near the fireplace, nearly outside the dining area. My name was spelled wrong. Ivy. Not Ivy. Celeste walked by as I stood there frozen. "We arranged the seats by contribution to the company," she said with a light laugh. "I'm sure you understand." Contribution. A word she loved using whenever she wanted to remind me that my work helping families secure safe housing wasn't real business. Guests continued finding their seats. My father took his place at the center, directly beneath a new gold banner, "Rutherford Legacy of Future Built on Excellence." Celeste sat beside him, Damon on his other side. It was the image of a perfect succession line, all clean edges and curated authority. And then something unexpected happened. My mother rose slowly from her seat near the center, swaying as if her body already knew the limits of her strength. She walked toward me, ignoring the way Celeste's lips tightened, and gently placed a hand on my back. "I think I'll sit with you tonight," Mom whispered, slipping into the chair beside mine. I bit my lip as emotions surged, but she squeezed my hand. "Proximity doesn't make family," she whispered. "Compassion does." The dinner began with my father's usual speech about growth, strength, and the Rutherford brand. Guests clapped enthusiastically. I clapped too, though. My mother's hand was trembling slightly in mine. She was paler than I'd ever seen her. The plates came out: roast tenderloin, Duchess potatoes, glazed vegetables. I could see Celeste glaring from the upper table. She hated disruptions to her perfect arrangements, even harmless ones like a seating change. When the gift exchange began, the room buzzed with excitement. Wrapped boxes piled high beneath the massive Christmas tree, shimmering with gold ribbon and matching tags. It was one of those traditions where the price tags mattered more than the sentiment. Celeste opened her gift first, a luxury designer bag worth more than my monthly salary. She held it up for the room to admire, camera flashes going off, as if she had just won an award. Damon unwrapped a sleek silver watch, engraved with future CEO. My father received a limited edition bourbon collectors would kill for. Then it was my turn. I opened a small bag from beneath the tree, pulling out a pair of socks, thin white, the kind sold in bulk packs at discount stores. The price tag was still attached. The room erupted with polite laughter. Damon clinked his glass and said, "Practical. That suits her." My face burned, but I forced a smile. My mother did not. She looked at the socks with such confusion and disappointment that for a moment I thought she might cry. She reached for my hand again, squeezing tighter than before. The humiliation didn't end there. Celeste tapped her glass, rising to stand beneath the gold banner. "Everyone," she announced, "I have some very exciting news." She placed one perfectly manicured hand on her chest. "I'm honored to share that I've been promoted to Chief Operating Officer of Rutherford Development Group." Applause thundered through the room. Celeste smiled with all the gleam of someone standing under a spotlight she believed she was born for. "At Rutherford," she continued, "leadership is earned, and we must honor those who carry our legacy into the future." Her eyes flicked to me for half a second. A deliberate reminder. Some people lead. Some are forgotten. Damon stood next, glass lifted. "A toast to the real pillars of the family, Dad, Celeste, and myself," he chuckled. "And to Ivy for her non-profit hobbies." More laughter. My mother's jaw clenched so hard I thought she might collapse under the strain of holding herself together. Later, after dessert plates were cleared, my mother tugged my sleeve. "Walk with me," she whispered. I guided her into the solarium, bathed in the soft glow of fairy lights. She lowered herself into a wicker chair, dusty from disuse. "There are things happening inside this family," she said softly. "Things you're not seeing yet." "What things?" I asked, leaning closer. She swallowed hard. "Promises broken. Choices made behind my back. People I thought I could trust." Her eyes glistened with something deeper than sorrow, fear. Before she could continue, she winced, clutching her chest. "Not now," she whispered. I'll tell you soon, I promise. We sat together in silence for a long time, watching snow drift against the glass. When we returned to the party, Celeste and Damon were standing near the fireplace, speaking to my father in low, urgent tones. "She's becoming clingy," Celeste hissed. "It's uncomfortable," Damon muttered. "She's trying to get sympathy. She knows she'll never inherit anything real." My father sighed. "We'll revisit the will after the holidays." I stopped mid-step. My mother, still beside me, froze. For a moment, neither of us breathed. They weren't just excluding me, they were erasing both of us. My mother's eyes filled with silent devastation. She turned away before they could see, and that was the night everything changed. I left early, slipping out a side door while the choir began singing carols for guests who still believed the Rutherford family was built on love and unity. As I drove home through falling snow, I didn't yet know that my mother had already begun her quiet rebellion, that she had already gathered allies and evidence, already planned what she would leave behind for me. All I knew was the heaviness of her heartbreak and the quiet, growing certainty that something inside our family was terribly, dangerously wrong. The call came just after 7 in the morning, sharp enough to slice through my half-sleep like a knife. I fumbled for my phone, expecting a reminder from work or a message from one of the housing clients I'd been helping. Instead, Nurse Marie's voice, tight trembling, rushed into my ear. "Ivy, your mother has been admitted. You should come now." I sat up so fast the room blurred. "Admitted? When what happened? She collapsed at home. The paramedics brought her in an hour ago. Her condition is unstable. Ivy, please hurry." Before I even hung up, I was already pulling on jeans, shoving my arms into a coat, grabbing my keys with shaking hands. I didn't brush my hair. I didn't check the mirror. My heart was pounding too violently to focus on anything except the image of my mother, pale and struggling to breathe. The city was barely awake as I drove, cold fog rolling low across the river, traffic lights blinking like warnings I couldn't afford to heed. I kept checking my phone for messages from my family. There were none. Not a single call, not a single text. The absence stung in a way that made the steering wheel blur. When I pushed through the doors of Portland Mercy's ICU, the smell of antiseptic and the hush of machines wrapped around me like a vice. Nurse Marie met me near the desk, dark circles under her eyes. "She's in room 312. Go quickly. She's been asking for you. Just me." I swallowed the ache rising in my throat and followed her down the hallway. When I stepped into my mother's room, I froze. She looked so small. Her skin was pale against the stark white sheets. Soft oxygen tubes looped around her cheeks. Machines beeped in uneven rhythms, each one a reminder of how fragile she was. Her eyes fluttered open at the sound of my footsteps, and when she saw me, her lips curved into the faintest smile. "There you are," she whispered. I rushed to her side. "Mom, I'm here. I'm right here." Her hand felt cooler today. She squeezed my fingers weakly. "Took you long enough." I laughed through a breath that shook. Traffic. Her eyes warmed. She always loved when I made her laugh, even in moments like this when every breath cost her something. "Where is everyone else?" she asked after a moment. I hesitated, and that was enough. Her expression softened with resignation. "They're not coming," she said. It wasn't a question. I shook my head. "I texted them. Dad said he'd keep me updated. Damon says he's in court. Celeste hasn't answered." My mother looked past me toward the ceiling as if searching for an old memory. "They've been gone a long time, Ivy. Their bodies were home, but their hearts left years ago." I didn't know what to say, so I just held her hand tighter. A doctor entered, a tall man with careful eyes and a clipboard in his hands. "Miss Rutherford?" He nodded to me. "I'm Dr. Kessler. I've been monitoring your mother's condition." "What's happening?" I asked, my voice barely steady. He exhaled softly. "Her heart is failing. We're doing everything we can to stabilize her, but her body is exhausted." He paused, choosing his words. She didn't want aggressive interventions. She was clear about that. My mother closed her eyes, her breath shallow. No more fighting, just presence. Dr. Kessler nodded respectfully and left us alone. I moved closer, lowering myself into the chair beside her bed. Do you need anything? Water-warm blanket? You, she whispered. Just you. I blinked back tears. My mother had always been strong, stronger than any of us. Seeing her like this was like watching the foundation of my world crack open. After a few minutes of silence, she turned her head toward me. Ivy, I need you to listen. Of course, I said, leaning in. There are things I never told you, she whispered. Things I hoped I'd have more time to explain. My heart dropped. Mom, what kind of things? She swallowed painfully. The company, your grandfather's legacy, it's not what it seems anymore. I stiffened. She continued slowly, carefully. There were decisions made without me. Things Celeste and Damon pushed through. Your father, he let them. Her lips trembled with frustration. They're planning changes, dangerous changes. I felt my pulse in my throat. What changes? She shook her head weakly. Not now. It will only upset you. And I need you calm for what comes next. What comes next? I whispered, brushing her hair gently. Her gaze drifted toward the window. You'll understand soon. The rest of the morning blurred into a cycle of nurses, checking her vitals machines, beeping her breath, hitching in ways that made my own lungs tighten in sympathy. I texted my family again, short, urgent messages. Mom is asking for you. Please come. She's fading. Nothing. As the afternoon slid toward evening, my mother drifted in and out of sleep. At one point, her eyes opened with surprising clarity. Come closer, she whispered. I leaned forward and she grasped my hand with a strength that startled me. Promise me one thing, she said. Promise me you won't let them erase what your grandfather built. Promise you won't let them bury the truth. Tears filled my eyes. I promise. Good, she breathed, her lips trembling. Check the letter, I frowned. The envelope, the one you gave, Nurse Marie. She nodded weakly. It has the names. The ones you can trust. My mouth went dry. You said they betrayed you. A small, sad smile touched her lips. Not all, but enough. Before I could ask anything else, she coughed violently, her entire body trembling. Nurses rushed in, adjusting wires, checking monitors. I stood back helpless because every movement seemed to drain more life from her. Hours felt like seconds. By nightfall, she was barely conscious. I sat at her bedside telling her stories from when I was little, stories. She once told me stories about gardening and baking and the way she used to hum while folding laundry. Anything to fill the silence. Anything to keep her with me a little longer. At 1:3 p.m., her eyes opened one last time. Ivy, she whispered, almost soundless. I leaned in, my forehead touching hers. I'm here, Mom. She smiled. A soft, fragile smile. You always were. Her hand slipped from mine. The monitor slowed, then steadied, then stopped. Nurse Marie appeared quietly at my side, her face lined with sorrow. She placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. She waited for you, she said again. I nodded, my chest cracking open with grief, but I didn't cry. Not yet. I kissed my mother's forehead, letting the warmth of her skin imprint itself into my memory. When I stepped out into the hallway, the weight of the envelope in my pocket felt heavier than ever. My mother died with secrets. And she trusted me, the outsider, the ignored, the underestimated, to bring them into the light. I pressed my palm against the pocket that held her letter and whispered to the empty corridor, I'll find out everything. I swear it. Outside, the December air hit me like a slap. My phone buzzed. One message from Damon. Mom, stable, right? I'll swing by tomorrow. A hollow sound escaped my throat, half laugh, half sob. Tomorrow was too late. My mother was gone, and the family that abandoned her had no idea what she had placed in my hands. The morning after my mother died felt too quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I moved through my house in a daze, the floorboards cold beneath my feet, the air smelling faintly of lavender from the blanket I had wrapped around myself the night before. Grief had a strange weight, one that settled into the muscles and made every movement feel heavier, slower. The envelope sat on my kitchen table like a living thing, its presence pulling at my attention no matter where I walked. I poured coffee. I didn't want just to give my hands something to do. Then sat down and unfolded my mother's letter again. The safe deposit number stared back at me, written in her slanted, weakening handwriting. Box 1174A. The tiny brass key taped beside it gleamed faintly in the morning light, as if urging me forward. Underneath the key was her final message. Inside is the truth they've buried for years. Protect it. I traced the words slowly with my thumb. My mother had planned this, every detail, every instruction, every precaution. She had carried secrets too heavy for one person, and she had chosen me, the daughter everyone else overlooked, to carry them for her. By the time I stood and grabbed my coat, resolve had settled inside me like a second heartbeat. I didn't feel ready, but I knew readiness wasn't what she needed from me. She needed courage. The drive to Rosewood Financial Bank took me through the heart of the city, past storefronts opening for the day, past construction sites my family's company owned. Men in reflective vests hammered steel beams into place, building a commercial complex my father bragged about like it was a testament to his brilliance. Seeing the Rutherford name plastered across the safety banners made my stomach twist. My family cared more about buildings than people. My mother had known that, and now I knew it too. Rosewood Financial sat in an old stone building with arched windows and a green copper roof. It looked like the kind of place that held secrets and never lost them. When I stepped inside, the polished floor reflected my face back at me, tired eyes, unbrushed hair, grief woven into every line. The bank manager approached with a polite smile. "Good morning. How can we assist you today?" I held up the key, with fingers that still shook slightly. "Safe deposit box, 1174A. His smile faded into something softer, more serious. "Of course. Please follow me." The vault area was colder than the rest of the bank, the air humming faintly from the heavy machinery that kept the steel doors locked tight. The manager led me to a long row of numbered boxes and stopped in front of mine. "Your mother was very clear. This box was intended solely for you," he said. "She came in a few months ago to update her instructions." My chest tightened. Even while dying, she had been preparing this moment. He inserted his master key, waited for me to insert mine, and when the lock clicked open, he withdrew his key and stepped back. "Take all the time you need." I slid the metal drawer out slowly, my breath catching when I saw what was inside: a black leather folder, a sealed envelope with my name. In my mother's handwriting, a small flash drive, and a worn notebook tied with twine. I carried everything to a small private booth and closed the door behind me. My heartbeat thudded loudly in the quiet space. The sealed envelope was labeled "For Ivy's eyes only." My hands shook as I opened it. My mother's handwriting was shaky but unmistakable. "My dearest Ivy, if you are reading this, it means I did not have the time or strength to tell you everything in person. I'm sorry for that. I wanted to spare you pain, but the truth won't stay buried, and you are the only one I trust to face what comes next." I stopped reading for a moment, pressing the back of my hand to my mouth as my eyes burned with tears. It felt like she was speaking directly into the room. "Your siblings, they made decisions without my consent. They pressured your father into choices he never should have made. They altered documents. They stole what was meant for the community and what was meant for you." My breath caught. I forced myself to keep reading. I collected evidence. I kept records of every meeting, every signature, every betrayal. I knew they would try to silence me. I knew I had to outsmart them. And I knew you had the heart and clarity to protect what matters. The letter ended with a sentence that felt like a blade and a blessing. "At once follow the paper trail. And choose your allies wisely." I folded the letter with trembling hands, then reached for the notebook. The leather cover was worn, the corners soft from years of handling. Inside pages were filled with my mother's neat handwriting, dates, meeting summaries, notes in the margins. One entry caught my eye. Celeste wants to gut the community housing division. Says it isn't profitable. Damon agrees. Raymond refuses to intervene. They don't see what this division means to people. They don't see what their father built. They want power, not purpose. I flipped through pages, horrified by what I found. Another entry: Damon created a shell company. Money is disappearing into it. I confronted him. He said, "I'm too emotional to understand business." Another: Celeste presented a forged document at the board meeting today. She didn't expect me to know what my real signature looks like. My stomach churned. Page after page revealed things so dark I could barely process them. When I reached the black folder, I hesitated before opening it. Something inside me already knew it would confirm what I feared. Inside were copies of legal documents, property transfers, approvals for projects that never existed, signatures that didn't match my mother's handwriting. Side by side, they painted the picture of a slow dismantling of everything my mother had built. The flash drive completed the picture. When I plugged it into the small bank computer in the booth, a series of folders appeared labeled by year. The earliest one, dated 2009, contained spreadsheets with financial discrepancies. The latest one had screenshots of emails. Emails from Damon mocking my mother's memory. Emails from Celeste talking about selling off the community housing division. Emails between accountants discussing redirected funds. One entire document detailed a missing $12 million. I covered my mouth with my hands as nausea rolled through me. My mother had carried this alone for years, betrayed not by strangers but by her own family. And she had kept it all so carefully, so quietly, just to make sure her story wouldn't be erased. When I opened the final document, a name jumped out at me: Patrick Lorne. One of the names on my mother's list. An accountant who had resigned suddenly 3 years ago. The file explained why. He had tried to expose the embezzlement. Damon threatened to ruin him. Another page contained an affidavit from Judge Miriam O'Neill, an explanation that she had notarized documents at my mother's request, confirming Helen's mental clarity and intent regarding her assets. I sat back in the booth, shaking. There was no denying the enormity of what I held. My mother hadn't left me a puzzle. She had left me a strategy. I placed everything back into the folder and hugged it to my chest. The realization settled heavily in my bones. I wasn't just her daughter. I was her last line of defense. As I walked toward the exit, the weight of the folder felt both crushing and electrifying. When I stepped into the cool air outside the bank, my phone buzzed. A message from Celeste's dad: "Wants to meet tonight. Family only. No apology, no explanation." And then another from Damon: "Don't do anything stupid, Ivy." I stared at their messages for a long moment before sliding my phone back into my pocket. Whatever they were planning, whatever they expected, I had something they didn't: the truth. And I wasn't afraid of them anymore. The Rutherford estate sat at the end of a winding drive, flanked by towering evergreens, the kind of trees that made the mansion look older, heavier, more rooted than it deserved to be. I parked halfway down the driveway, letting the engine idle for a moment as I stared at the house. I'd been here thousands of times growing up, yet tonight it felt like a stranger, silent, watching, waiting. The family meeting had been ordered, not requested. Dad's text had read, "Be here at 7, important." No condolences for Mom, no acknowledgement of her passing, just business like always. I killed the engine and stepped out, clutching the folder from the safe deposit box under my coat. The December air was sharp, but it wasn't the cold that made me shiver. It was the dread pooling low in my stomach, the sense that I was walking straight into a storm I didn't fully understand. When I reached the front door, I paused for a breath, then knocked once out of habit before letting myself in. They were all there. Celeste stood by the fireplace, arms cross-dressed in one of her immaculate cream blouses. Damon sat on the leather sofa, tapping his foot with impatient energy. Dad stood near the bar cart, pouring himself a drink with the stoic expression he wore whenever he had important matters to discuss. All three turned when they heard me enter. Celeste's eyes took me in rumpled coat, tired face, red-rimmed eyes, and she offered a thin, disapproving smile. "You're late." "I'm 10 minutes early," I replied quietly. She shrugged. "Semantics." Dad gestured stiffly toward a seat. "Let's get started." I didn't sit. "Before anything, I need to ask. Why weren't any of you at the hospital yesterday?" Damon scoffed. "Ivy, not this again." My jaw tightened. "Mom asked for you. All of you." "We had obligations," Celeste said, lifting her chin. "The world doesn't stop because Mom had a scare." "She didn't have a scare," I snapped before I could stop myself. "She died." An uncomfortable silence dropped over the room. Dad swallowed a sip of whiskey. "Your mother's passing is unfortunate, but that doesn't change what we need to address tonight." I stared at him, disbelief clawing at my throat. "Unfortunate?" Celeste sighed dramatically. "Ivy, don't be emotional. Dad's trying to emotional." My voice shook. "She was your mother too," barely Damon muttered, rising from the sofa to fix himself a drink. "She stopped being part of this family the moment she stopped contributing." A crack rang out before I realized the sound came from the glass in my hand hitting the floor. It shattered across the hardwood, spraying tiny shards. Damon didn't even flinch. "See, emotional." I took a slow breath, forcing my hands not to shake. "What exactly are we addressing tonight?" Dad cleared his throat. "Your mother's estate." My fingers tightened around the folder. "Already? She died yesterday. We have a company to protect," Celeste snapped. "Delays are dangerous." "Dangerous to who?" I asked. Celeste's eyes narrowed. "To all of us. We need to realign control. Decisions must be consolidated. Assets secured." Dad and I agreed that we should finalize the inheritance adjustments Mom was too unwell to complete. Inheritance adjustments? My stomach sank. "And what adjustments would those be?" I asked. Celeste hesitated just a fraction too long. Dad stepped in. "You're not involved in the business, Ivy. You've made that clear for years. It's only logical that operational control remains with the three of us." "Operational control," I repeated slowly. "Meaning what?" Damon downed his drink and set the glass down loudly. "Meaning you'll sign a disclaimer of interest in the company assets. It's a formality. Standard. They had rehearsed this. Planned it." My pulse thundered in my ears as the pieces clicked into place, every cold shoulder, every lie, every meeting from which I was excluded. They hadn't just abandoned Mom at the end. They'd cut her out long before. "And what happens after I sign?" I asked. "You'll still inherit some personal items," Celeste said with a shrug. "Jewelry. Sentimental things. Mom's programs," I whispered. "The community housing. The initiatives she worked on for decades," Damon answered before anyone else could. "Those are being reevaluated. They drain resources, Ivy. They're not profitable." My vision blurred at the edges. Profitable, that word again, that poison. I lifted my gaze slowly. "So Mom dies and the first thing you do is strip her legacy for parts." "Her legacy is the company," Dad snapped. "No," I said, my voice low. "Her legacy was people." None of them reacted. Not even a flicker of recognition. It hit me then: my mother had died loving people who were incapable of loving her back. Dad nodded toward a file on the coffee table. "Here's the document. Sign it and we'll handle the rest." I felt the last threads of restraint snap inside me. "I'm not signing anything," Damon sighed loudly. I knew she'd be difficult. Celeste rolled her eyes. "This is why Mom never trusted her with anything important." The irony almost made me laugh. They had no idea. I stepped closer to the coffee table and picked up their document with 2 fingers like it was something dirty. My eyes scanned the text. It was exactly what I expected: a formal relinquishment of interest in the company's assets and holdings. I let the paper drop back onto the table. "No," I said again. Dad's expression hardened. "You don't have a choice." I reached into my coat and pulled out my mother's leather folder. "Yes," I whispered, "I do." Celeste's eyes widened. Damon froze mid-step. Dad's jaw clenched. "What's that?" Celeste demanded. I placed the folder gently on the table, letting the silver edge catch the light. "Mom left it for me." Damon laughed nervously. "Oh, please. Mom didn't trust you with a grocery list." I didn't look at him. She trusted me with the truth. Celeste stepped forward, fear flickering in her eyes. "What truth?" "The paper trail," I whispered. "The one she kept for years." Dad paled. "What paper trail?" I met his gaze dead on. "The one that starts with missing funds and ends with forged signatures. You could have heard a pin drop." Celeste's breath hitched. Damon's knuckles went white around his empty glass. Dad's face drained of color, as though someone had pulled the foundation out from under him. I continued my voice, steadying with every word. "I know about the shell companies, the stolen money, the programs you planned to gut. And I know who helped you." Celeste's voice cracked. "You don't know anything." I tapped the folder. "Mom kept everything." Damon took a slow step backward. "She wasn't confused," I said. "She wasn't weak. She wasn't losing her mind." My throat tightened. She was documenting her betrayal. Celeste's voice was barely a whisper. "Where did she get that?" "She didn't get it," I said. "She lived it." Silence swallowed the room whole. I picked up the folder and tucked it under my arm. "I'm leaving," I said quietly. "When you're ready to talk like human beings, not vultures, call me." No one moved. No one stopped me. And as I stepped into the cold night air, I finally understood why my mother put those names, that key, that evidence into my hands. She knew this day would come. She knew her children would choose power over her. She knew they would never choose me. But she also knew something they refused to accept. I wasn't the weak one. I was the one they should have feared. The voicemail came while I was sitting in my car outside a grocery store, hands still gripping the steering wheel, the folder of my mother's documents burning a hole in the passenger seat. I didn't recognize the number, but something in my gut told me to answer. I let it go to voicemail anyway. My nerves were too frayed to deal with one more unknown. When I finally played the message, the voice that spilled through the speaker made my heart stop. "Ivy, this is Martin Reyes. Your mother told me to expect your call someday. I need to speak with you immediately. Please, you're not safe. They know someone has the documents. Don't go home alone tonight." His voice cracked on the last word. I replayed it 3 times, each repetition tightening the pressure in my chest. Martin Reyes, former Rutherford Development Group CFO, fired under suspicious circumstances. The first name on my mother's list. I didn't think. I hit call. He answered on the first ring. "Ivy," he whispered, like saying my name out loud might endanger us both. "Yes, I got your message." He exhaled shakily. Good. I didn't know if... I wasn't sure you'd call. I read Mom's documents. Your name was there. Marked with a star." I paused. "Did she tell you what she was planning?" A soft, bitter laugh. "She didn't need to. I saw what your siblings were doing years ago. Helen was the only one fighting them, and she fought until they pushed her out of her own company." My grip tightened on the phone. "Martin, what do you know?" "Too much," he whispered. "And not nearly enough." A rustling sound, as if he'd turned his head to check behind him. "We can't talk on the phone. It's not safe." Every instinct told me to listen. "Where do we meet?" I asked. "Riverfront Park," he said. "The old pedestrian bridge. Dusk. Walk alone, but make sure you're not followed." I hung up, pulse pounding, as dread curled into my stomach. My siblings weren't just greedy. They weren't just callous. According to my mother's files and now Martin, they were dangerous. I drove home only long enough to drop off the folder in a locked drawer and grab a warmer coat. As I headed toward the river, the winter sun dipped low behind the skyline, turning the water into a sheet of dull silver. Even so, the air felt colder than it should have. Martin was already there. He stood under a street lamp at the edge of the bridge. "Ivy," he whispered, like saying my name out loud might endanger us both. "Yes, I got your message." He exhaled shakily. Good. I didn't know if... I wasn't sure you'd call. I read Mom's documents. Your name was there, marked with a star. I paused. Did she tell you what she was planning? A soft, bitter laugh? She didn't need to. I saw what your siblings were doing years ago. Helen was the only one fighting them, and she fought until they pushed her out of her own company. Martin pulled a flash drive from his coat, his fingers trembling. This is mine, not the one your mother left you. These are the documents they fired me for. I took it carefully, sliding it into my pocket. I thought they fired you because you disagreed with Dad, I said. His laugh was sharp and humorless. Disagreed, Ivy? Your brother and sister were stealing from the company. They were forging approvals. They were hiding losses and inflating gains. His eyes darkened. Your father knew. He pretended not to, but he knew. My breath fogged in the cold air. How much did they steal? That's the thing, he whispered. It wasn't all about money. At first, yes, 12 million diverted from the community housing division over 7 years. I felt sick, Martin continued, voice low. Then they went after control. They pressured Helen to sign documents she didn't understand. When she refused, they forged her signature. My hand flew to my mouth. Oh my God. Your mother confided in me, he said. She trusted me to keep copies of everything. But when Damon found out I was asking questions, he threatened me. Told me he'd ruin me, said he'd make sure every firm in Portland knew I was unstable. My stomach twisted at the familiar cruelty. He told me to resign quietly, Martin said, eyes fixed on the water. I didn't have a choice. I have a daughter. I couldn't risk losing everything. Silence hung between us, heavy and cold. I finally whispered, why did my mother trust me with this? Why not the board or the police? His voice softened. Because you're nothing like them. You don't measure your worth by spreadsheets or property lines. You care about people just like she did. His gaze met mine. She believed you were the only one with the heart and the courage to face this. My throat tightened so painfully I couldn't speak. Martin looked away again, scanning the trees. There's more you need to know, and more people you need to talk to. Patrick Lorne has information, at least he used to, but he's afraid. Afraid of what I asked. Martin's jaw clenched. Your brother, Damon, has connections, friends in legal places, powerful ones. My pulse quickened. Did Mom know that she knew everything he said? She started gathering allies years ago. Judge O'Neill, Evelyn Shore, people she trusted. She knew her children might betray her. His voice cracked. She didn't want to believe it, but she knew. A sharp wind gusted across the bridge and Martin shivered. Ivy, he said, your mother kept a voice recording. It's the most important piece of evidence. She was terrified to give it to me directly. She said she'd leave it for you. A recording of what I asked. His face twisted with something like grief. A boardroom conversation. One where Celeste calls the community housing division dead weight. One where Damon says you're too weak to fight them. One where Raymond agrees to change the inheritance. My chest ached like someone had pressed a fist to it. Martin reached into his coat again, handing me a small USB drive. That's the copy I kept. I didn't dare play it until your mother passed. When I did, I realized you needed to hear it. I swallowed hard. Why didn't you go to the authorities? I have a family, he said quietly. And your siblings are ruthless when backed into a corner. The fear in his voice chilled me more than the wind. He stepped back. You need to be careful, Ivy. This isn't just corruption. This is a family empire. People kill for less. A cold shiver crawled up my spine. Where do I start? I whispered. With the truth, he said. And with the other names on Helen's list. They all know a part of the story. I nodded, gripping the flash drive so tightly the edges pressed into my palm. Martin hesitated, then said softly, your mother told me once that compassion is mistaken for weakness. But she believed it was the strongest thing a leader could have. She saw that in you. His voice wavered. Don't let them break you the way they broke her. I felt tears sting my eyes. I won't. He gave me one last heartbreaking smile, sad, grateful, resigned. Good, he said. Because the next part won't be easy. When he walked away, disappearing into the fog along the riverbank, I stood there alone, the dark water rippling under the bridge. The city lights flickered in the distance. My breath clouded in front of me in uneven bursts. I finally turned toward my car. But as I drove home, headlights appeared behind me, bright, too close, following every turn. When I sped up, they sped up. Cold fear shot through me. Only when I pulled sharply into a gas station did the other car slow, hesitate, then turn away. I sat frozen behind the wheel, heart racing. Martin was right. Finding the truth was dangerous. Exposing it would be deadly. I hadn't stepped foot inside the Rutherford Hills mansion since the night they dismissed my mother's life as an inconvenience, and returning now on Thanksgiving felt like walking into a lion's den with nothing but my mother's notebook tucked beneath my coat. The driveway glimmered under strings of golden lights, valets in black jackets, jogging back and forth while guests climbed out of luxury cars and hurried toward warmth and wine. I stood at the bottom of the steps for a moment, letting the cold air brace me. Every instinct begged me to turn around. But I wasn't here to belong. I was here to disrupt. Inside, the warmth hit me like a wave. Guests filled the marble foyer, music drifted from the live quartet near the staircase, and the dining hall sparkled in perfect coordination. White candles, gold-trimmed china floral centerpieces, taller than the children weaving beneath them. Celeste always did love a spectacle. She spotted me from across the room and approached with a smile so brittle I could hear the crack behind it. "Oh," she said lightly, "you came. How thoughtful." Invitations usually imply that I replied. Her eyes narrowed, but she smoothed the expression quickly. "Dinner starts in 10, Damon said without looking up from his phone. "Try not to sit in the wrong place this year." I ignored him and stepped into the great room. That familiar sensation swept over me, the feeling of entering a space where my presence was tolerated but unwanted, where every conversation seemed to lower in volume when I entered. A cousin whispered to another, "Did she even dress up?" Another murmured, "I thought she wouldn't show." I kept walking. The banquet table was set in a long L shape this year, seating nearly 40. I found the place cards easily. My family always made sure I sat as far from them as possible. My card was placed at the far corner, half a hallway away, practically pressed up against the fireplace tools. Someone had scribbled the name wrong again. Ivy. I lifted the card between two fingers and exhaled slowly. They couldn't even bother to spell my name correctly after 32 years. From across the table, Celeste watched me, her lips curving smugly. Her seating chart was a weapon, and she wielded it with precision. A few seats down, my mother's chair sat empty, draped with a soft shawl. Raymond had insisted it remain that way for tradition, he said, though he barely acknowledged her presence in the last years of her life. Seeing that empty chair tightened something inside my chest. The sound of glass clinking echoed through the room, signaling the beginning of dinner. I took my seat alone as servers placed dishes before us. Laughter filled the air, loud, confident, scripted. When the first toast began, Raymond stood lifting his crystal glass in performative solemnity. "Family is our foundation," he announced. "A legacy built on unity, strength, and leadership." I almost choked on my water. He continued, voice rich and booming. "We honor those who dedicate themselves to maintaining the Rutherford name." My eyes flicked to Celeste, who beamed as though spotlights were trained on her. Damon smirked proudly. Then Raymond said something that made my hands go still. "And this year," he declared, "we prepare for the next chapter of Rutherford leadership." A ripple of applause spread down the table. My stomach twisted. I knew what next chapter meant. Coming from him, more consolidation, more erasure, more power shoved into the hands that least deserved it. I kept my gaze on my plate, letting their pride wash over me like static. After appetizers were cleared, Celeste tapped her glass. "Before we move on," she announced, "I'd like to share exciting news." Of course she would. "I've been selected to lead our next expansion project," she said, her voice bright with triumph. A reallocation of assets within the company. My chest tightened. Assets, company, reallocation. The words echoed the documents in my mother's folder. Celeste continued. Some outdated divisions will be downsized or restructured to maximize profitability. My fork clattered against my plate. Outdated, divisions, maximize profitability, community housing, senior support centers, affordable housing units, all of Mom's programs. Celeste was planning to gut them. Damon took a turn, next rising with a poorly concealed smirk. And let's not forget the real pillars of this family, he said, raising his glass. Dad, Celeste, and myself working tirelessly to keep the Rutherford name at the forefront of Portland's development sector. He paused dramatically, and Ivy, the room quieted, all eyes shifting toward me, always doing her best to support whatever it is she supports. A wave of laughter rolled through the table. The buildings with the Rutherford name still stood tall, but for the first time I wasn't looking up at them like an outsider. Mom trusted me for a reason, and now I finally understood why. The battles were ending, but the war for her legacy had only just begun. The building was still dark when I arrived, the sky only beginning to pale behind the downtown skyline. Rutherford Development Group loomed ahead, tall and quiet, its glass catching the faintest hint of morning light. A calm I didn't recognize settled over me. I reached the front, set my small tote bag on the edge of the table, and pulled out the USB drive Martin had given me. I need to say something, I said, my voice steady but loud enough to fill the room. The dining hall fell silent. At the hospital, I continued, Mom told me she kept receipts. She said truth doesn't disappear just because powerful people hide it. Celeste's face drained of color. Damon stiffened. Raymond's hand froze midair, still holding his fork. Ivy, Celeste began stepping forward. I held up the USB. This is one of them. Before anyone could stop me, I reached behind the head table and connected the drive to the AV panel used for company presentations. The flat screen above the fireplace blinked awake. You can't do this, Celeste hissed. I can, I said, and I will. The room held its breath. Then a voice crackled through the speakers. Celeste's voice. Once Mom's gone, we sell everything. The community housing division is dead weight. Gasps broke across the room. Then Damon's voice. Ivy won't fight us. She never does. She's weak. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, eyes turning toward me. Then horrifyingly, Raymond's. We'll finalize the inheritance revisions next week. A hand went to a chest, another to a mouth. Several guests stood abruptly. Celeste lunged toward the panel. Turn it off. This is private. This is illegal. I blocked her path. You want to talk about illegal? Let's discuss forged signatures, shell companies, missing funds, silence. You could hear the crackle of the fireplace. I turned to my father. You planned to cut out Mom's programs. You were going to rewrite the will. And you were going to hide it behind the Rutherford name like you always do. Raymond's face reddened. That's enough. No, I said, finally finding my full voice. Enough is what I've tolerated for years. I turned to the guests, our board members, investors, relatives. For anyone who believes this is an isolated incident, I said, I have more. Documents, emails, signatures my mother didn't write. Celeste's voice trembled. You're lying. I pulled out my mother's notebook and set it on the table beside her plate. She kept everything. Damon swallowed his bravado, cracking. We can explain. You won't need to explain to me, I said quietly. You'll explain it to the court. Whispers surged around the room like a current. Celeste looked ready to scream. Damon looked ready to flee. Raymond looked like he'd aged 10 years. I'm done being quiet, I said, stepping back from the table. No one stopped me this time. I walked toward the exit, each step echoing across the marble floor like a verdict. When I reached the doorway, my phone buzzed. A text from Judge O'Neill. I heard the recording. Come to my office tomorrow. We have work to do. I glanced back one last time at the glowing mansion, once a monument, to power now cracking under the weight of the truth. Tonight wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters when I arrived, cameras already pointed toward the entrance, as if they were waiting for a parade of villains to march through the doors. In a way, they were. Headlines had spread overnight like wildfire. The audio recording from Thanksgiving leaked through a distant cousin who apparently couldn't resist the lure of a scandal. Every major local outlet had picked it up. Some national ones, too. I kept my eyes down as I climbed the granite steps, my mother's notebook tucked safely in my bag, the folder of documents pressed over my heart like armor. Judge Miriam O'Neill walked beside me, her pace steady, her presence calm. She didn't say much, but the brief nod she gave me as we approached the entrance sent a quiet message. You're not alone. The moment I crossed into the courthouse, my phone buzzed with what felt like 100 notifications. I ignored them. All that mattered today was the truth. The hearing was scheduled in courtroom 3, large, echoing, too cold for comfort. Rows of benches were filled with faces I recognized from Christmas parties, company events, board meetings. Some curious, some judgmental, some sympathetic, the rest hungry. And then they entered. Celeste came in first, her cream-colored coat tailored to perfection, but her face brittle and pale. Damon followed close behind with an attorney in a $1,000 suit, though his hands shook as he straightened his tie. Raymond entered last, shoulders squared, jaw set, like he believed he still had authority here. The three of them avoided looking at me. Good. The judge presiding over the case, Honorable Daniel Hollander, struck his gavel lightly. This session will now come to order. I took a deep breath. Judge O'Neill stepped forward first. Your Honor, before we begin, I am submitting into evidence my notarized affidavit regarding the mental competence and intentions of the late Helen Rutherford. The courtroom rustled with whispers. Celeste stiffened. Damon's lawyer leaned forward sharply. Judge Hollander skimmed the affidavit, lips pressing into a tight line. This is substantial, it is, Judge O'Neill said. Mrs. Rutherford was fully coherent and intentional when she entrusted certain documents to her daughter Ivy prior to her passing. Celeste's voice cracked. She was ill, she wasn't thinking clearly. Judge Hollander raised an eyebrow. The affidavit clearly states otherwise. Sit down, Miss Rutherford. Celeste obeyed, seething. I tried not to smile. Next, I stepped forward. My knees trembled, but my voice didn't. Your Honor, my mother kept detailed records of financial misconduct within Rutherford Development Group. She gathered them because she feared for the company's future and her own safety. I placed the folder on the evidence table. Inside were copies of emails, forged documents, spreadsheets showing millions missing from the Community Housing Division, and my mother's handwritten notes chronicling every betrayal. Judge Hollander examined the stack, flipping through pages that should never have existed in a legitimate company. Mr. Linden, he said to Damon's lawyer, your clients have a considerable amount to answer for. Damon's lawyer cleared his throat. Your Honor, these documents may be falsified. We cannot assume their authenticity. Actually, Judge O'Neill interjected, I notarized several of those pages myself. Gasps filled the courtroom. Damon's lawyer faltered. We request time to review. No, Judge, Hollander said sharply. We will proceed. I stepped back, pulse racing. Next came the audio. I'd heard bits of it before, but hearing it now, echoing across the courtroom, filling every corner of the room with the raw, undeniable cruelty of my own family, twisted something deep inside me. Celeste's voice sounded smug. Once Mom's gone, we sell everything. The Community Housing Division is dead weight. Damon's voice followed. Ivy won't fight us. She never does. She's weak. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Then came Raymond's voice, flat, cold. We'll finalize inheritance revisions next week. Silence fell like a dropped curtain. Judge Hollander's face hardened. Miss Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Raymond Rutherford. Would you like to explain these statements? Celeste rose, hands trembling. This was taken out of context. We were discussing theoretical. Sit down, the judge snapped. I've heard enough. Even Damon didn't try to speak. Then something unexpected happened. A single mother from one of my mom's housing programs stood up waiting until the judge acknowledged her. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady, Helen Rutherford saved my life. She saved my children. And she told me someone inside the company was sabotaging her work. She never said who, but she knew. Another person rose, a construction worker who'd been with the company for 30 years. Helen told us someone was stealing. She tried to protect the community projects. She was fighting alone. I blinked as my eyes filled with tears. I hadn't known my mother had told anyone else. I hadn't known she tried to warn them. Judge Hollander nodded. Thank you both. The hearing moved to the will. Judge O'Neill stepped forward again with the sealed packet my mother had stored in the bank vault. Your Honor, this is Mrs. Rutherford's notarized will and estate plan. The true final version. Celeste shot to her feet. That's impossible. I saw the will Mom signed. You saw the forged one, I said quietly. Celeste paled. Judge Hollander opened the will. His expression shifted with each paragraph he read aloud. Helen left. 32% of the company to me. All oversight of the community housing division to me. Limited operational roles to Celeste. Property-based assets only to Damon. A ceremonial non-controlling title to Raymond. It was devastating for them. It was validation for me. Damon's lawyer sputtered. Your Honor, surely this will judge. Hollander interrupted. Is notarized, documented, and legally airtight. It supersedes all other documents. He turned to the room. I hereby rule this as the true and enforceable estate plan of the late Helen Rutherford. The courtroom erupted in reactions, some shocked, some furious, some relieved. Celeste stumbled backward, grabbing the table for support. Damon stared at the floor, jaw clenched so tight it shook. Raymond closed his eyes, his entire body sagging under the weight of his downfall. Judge Hollander wasn't finished. I am also freezing all planned company restructures and ordering a full investigation into financial misconduct with special attention to the forged signatures and missing funds. Gasps swept the room. Damon whispered something to his lawyer, something that sounded suspiciously like, fix this. The lawyer shook his head. I can't. Then came the final blow. As of this ruling, the judge said Ivy Rutherford is recognized as the legal primary heir of the Rutherford estate and the controlling stakeholder in Rutherford Development Group. My knees nearly buckled, but I stayed standing. A tear slid down my cheek, grief, relief, vindication, all wrapped together like tangled wire. The judge rapped his gavel once. This hearing is adjourned. Reporters surged forward. Family members murmured angrily. Celeste and Damon whispered furiously to each other. Raymond didn't move at all. I slipped out the side door, Judge O'Neill guiding me through the hallway. My phone buzzed as we stepped outside. A text from an unknown number. This isn't over. You don't know everything they've done. A chill crept down my spine. I looked up at the towering buildings bearing my family's name, buildings I now owned. The truth was out. But the war for my mother's legacy had only begun. The morning after the court ruling felt unreal. I woke to a phone vibrating endlessly on my nightstand, the screen lighting up with headlines I never imagined would exist in the same universe as my name. Rutherford hires, exposed in inheritance scandal, daughter. Rutherford named primary heir forged, signatures missing, millions secret will community housing saved from shutdown. My throat tightened as I scrolled. Each headline brought a strange mix of relief and grief, relief that my mother's truth was finally out, grief that everything she fought for had been dangled over the edge of destruction by the very people she raised. My coffee grew cold on the table as I stood by the window watching the city wake. Portland looked the same as yesterday, the same buses, same distant hum of traffic, same low clouds, but nothing in my life felt familiar. I showered, dressed in a navy coat Mom once bought me, and forced myself to breathe slowly. Today wouldn't be easier. Today was when consequences would begin to land. At 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a text from an employee at Rutherford Development Group. "You should come in. Everything's chaotic." I grabbed my bag, slipped Mom's notebook inside, and headed out. When I reached headquarters, the atmosphere was electric, but not with excitement. The lobby buzzed with whispers. Employees gathered in clusters, eyes darting toward the elevators as if expecting someone to be dragged out in handcuffs. A receptionist I barely knew approached me nervously. "Miss Rutherford." Ivy, thank you for saving the community housing division. Helen talked about it every day." The unexpected kindness nearly broke me. "Thank you," I whispered. When I stepped into the executive hallway, the energy shifted. A freeze of silence fell. People stared, some with relief, some with awe, some with fear. Then I heard Celeste. "Give me my laptop back. You can't, just." A compliance officer stepped out of her office holding a company-issued laptop sealed in an evidence bag. "Miss Rutherford, the board has ordered a full internal investigation. We require all company equipment." Celeste made a strangled sound. "I am the company." "Not anymore," the officer said calmly. I watched as my sister, the immaculate, untouchable Celeste, gripped the edge of her desk, her face pale with fury. When her eyes landed on me, something inside them cracked. "You did this," she hissed. "No," I said quietly. "You did." Her lips trembled before she turned away, blinking furiously. Damon's collapse came next. I heard the argument before I reached the conference room. "You can't suspend me," he shouted. "I'm the lead counsel." "This is ridiculous." A partner from his law group stood firm. "Your license is under emergency review. The forged documents linked to you are part of an active criminal investigation." Damon swore and slammed his fist onto the table hard enough for papers to scatter. When he looked up and saw me standing in the doorway, he froze, rage twisting into something more fragile. "You're happy now," he spat. "No," I said. "This isn't happiness." He scoffed, but his eyes looked glassy. Employees gathered in clusters, eyes darting toward the elevators as if expecting someone to be dragged out in handcuffs. A receptionist I barely knew approached me nervously. "Miss Rutherford." Ivy, thank you for saving the community housing division. Helen talked about it every day." The unexpected kindness nearly broke me. "Thank you," I whispered. When I stepped into the executive hallway, the energy shifted. A freeze of silence fell. People stared, some with relief, some with awe. A third, "This must be addressed." Raymond straightened slowly, looking around the room as if seeing strangers. Then his gaze found me. "I built this company," he said quietly. "No," I said, my voice soft but unwavering. "Grandfather built it. Mom protected it. You let it rot." For a moment I saw something like guilt flash across his face, but it was quickly replaced by anger. "We're not finished," he warned. "Yes, a board member said you are." I had never seen my father fall silent so quickly. That afternoon the board called an emergency session. I sat near the back, still an outsider by instinct, even as whispers filled the room. "She saved the community division. She has the documents. She's the only one Helen trusted. She's not like the others." The board chair, a gray-haired man who had known my mother well, cleared his throat. "We need new leadership," he said plainly. "Someone who respects the company's origins and cares about the people we serve." His eyes landed on me. "The board nominates Ivy Rutherford as strategic chair and acting executive lead." A soft gasp rippled through the room. My breath caught. Celeste whispered, No, this is insane." Damon muttered, "She can't lead anything." But the board wasn't listening to them anymore. One by one, hands rose in support. 11, 12, 13, a majority. The vote passed. Celeste sank into her chair. Damon stared at the table. Raymond's jaw tightened until he looked like stone. I didn't trust myself to stand immediately. When I finally rose, the room grew quiet. "I'll do everything I can," I said. "Not for the title, not for the name, but for the people my mother cared about." Not one board member objected. The moment the meeting ended, I stepped into the hallway and exhaled shakily, leaning against the wall. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. A handful of employees approached me. A receptionist whispered, "Helen always said you'd change the company." A project manager, one who'd worked under Celeste for a decade, said softly, "We've been waiting for someone like you." Even a senior accountant squeezed my hand and said, "Your mother believed in you, so do we." Their words wrapped around me like a blanket I didn't know I needed. Later that day, reports came in of Celeste being escorted out of the building. Damon's law license officially went under suspension. Raymond received an ultimatum: resign or face forced removal. Their empire, built on intimidation, on silence, on cruelty, was collapsing. Not because I destroyed it, because they did. By evening, the building was nearly empty. I walked into my mother's old office slowly, the door creaking open as if exhaling a memory. The space was untouched. Her favorite plant still in the corner. Her framed photo from a community event still on the shelf. The desk immaculate. I sat in her chair, the leather hugging me the way she used to. I placed her notebook in the center of the desk and rested my hand on it. "I did it," I whispered. "I kept your legacy alive." Grief washed over me, warm and crushing, but behind it stronger was peace. Not the soft kind, but the fierce kind that comes after surviving something you thought might break you. Just as I stood to leave, my phone buzzed. A message from the board chair: "We'll need you to guide the next phase. But be prepared, your family won't go quietly. There are things we haven't told you yet." I stared at the words, feeling the weight of them settle into my bones. Of course it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I looked out the massive office window toward the city lights glowing against the dark skyline. Board members sat with papers and tablets before them. Investors lined the walls. A few community representatives, people my mother had fought for, sat near the back. The other Rutherford siblings' names sat on empty chairs, Celeste's seat vacant, Damon's untouched. Their absence felt like the physical echo of their downfall. Raymond stood stiffly at the far end of the room, arms crossed, eyes cold. If he was embarrassed, he hid it well. The board chair, "Mr." I sat in my car for a moment, fingers curled around the leather-bound notebook in my lap, my mother's handwriting pressed into every page, her voice stitched into every line. Today was the vote. Today, everything changed. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance. The security guard, an older man with kind eyes, straightened when he saw me. "Good luck today, Miss Rutherford," he said softly. "Helen would be proud." The words hit me with unexpected force. I nodded, unable to speak, and continued inside. The hallway leading to the executive boardroom hummed with nervous energy. Employees moved quickly, whispering to one another, glancing at their phones, turning toward me with hope, curiosity, even something like relief. I'd always been invisible in these halls. Now people stepped aside to let me pass. When I reached the boardroom, the door was already open. I paused at the threshold, taking in the scene. Every seat was filled. Board members sat with papers and tablets before them. Investors lined the walls. A few community representatives, people my mother had fought for, sat near the back. The other Rutherford siblings' names sat on empty chairs, Celeste's seat vacant, Damon's untouched. Their absence felt like the physical echo of their downfall. Raymond stood stiffly at the far end of the room, arms crossed, eyes cold. If he was embarrassed, he hid it well. The board chair, "Mr." Later that day, reports came in of Celeste being escorted out of the building. Damon's law license officially went under suspension. Raymond received an ultimatum: resign or face forced removal. Their empire, built on intimidation, on silence, on cruelty, was collapsing. Not because I destroyed it, because they did. By evening, the building was nearly empty. I walked into my mother's old office slowly, the door creaking open as if exhaling a memory. The space was untouched. "As you all know," Langford said, "in light of the court's ruling yesterday and the overwhelming evidence presented, we must establish new interim leadership for the company." A murmur moved through the room. For decades, Rutherford Development Group has been guided by tradition, some of it admirable, some of it deeply flawed. Today, we choose a new path. He glanced toward me. The board formally nominates Ivy Rutherford for the role of strategic chair and acting executive lead. Silence. Heavy expectant charged. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. Then someone spoke. No, Raymond said sharply, standing straighter. Absolutely not. Dozens of eyes shifted to him. She's inexperienced, he said. Emotional. She doesn't understand the complexities of our operations. She'll destroy what we built. What you built, someone muttered. Or what Helen saved. Raymond ignored it, his voice rising. This is sentimental nonsense. My mother's sunken face flashed in my mind, her cold hand in mine, her voice, "You're the only one I trust." My pulse throbbed in my ears. When dessert was served, I stood. At first, no one noticed. The room buzzed with conversation and clinking silverware. But when I stepped toward the head of the table, my heels clicking sharply against the marble, the noise dimmed. Celeste's eyes darted nervously. "Ivy, what are you doing? Sit down." I kept walking. Raymond scowled. "Don't make a scene." A soft murmur of agreement rippled through the room. I continued, "I'm not here to erase the past. I'm here to repair it, to honor it, and to rebuild things the right way." Langford nodded, then raised his hand. "All those in favor of appointing Miss Rutherford as strategic chair." Hands lifted. 1, 5, 10, 14 of 17. Raymond remained motionless, jaw clenched so tight I thought it might crack. "The majority has spoken," Langford announced. "The motion passes." A wave of emotion surged through me. Relief, fear, pride, gratitude. My mother's voice echoed in my memory. "Build a life where you are honored, not tolerated." I blinked hard against the tears threatening to fall. My first act as chair came moments later. "I'd like to reinstate the Helen Rutherford Community Care Initiative," I said, effective immediately. "And I want a full audit of all financial departments conducted by an independent firm." Even those who had been skeptical nodded. "Seconded," Langford said. The vote passed unanimously. After the meeting, employees lined the hallway. Some clapped. Some offered small, grateful nods. A few even smiled with a kind of hope I hadn't seen in the building for years. It felt surreal. As I reached the elevator, a woman from accounting stopped me. "Helen always said you'd rise when the time was right," she whispered, wiping her eyes. I swallowed hard. "Thank you." Upstairs, I found Raymond waiting in the hallway outside my mother's old office. His arms were crossed, but his eyes looked tired, older than I'd ever seen him. "I want a word," he said. I followed him to an empty conference room, keeping my distance. The silence stretched. Finally, he spoke. "You embarrassed this family." "No," I said softly. "You did that." He flinched. "I know you think you're doing the right thing," he said, "but you don't understand what leadership requires." "Neither did you," I replied. "That's why this happened." His jaw worked as if he wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. "You could still join us," he said suddenly. "We could present a united front. Tell the board the family stands together." "I'm not covering for you," I said. "Not anymore." Something in him collapsed, then something hard, brittle, long overdue. "You're choosing the company over your family," he whispered bitterly. "No," I said. "I'm choosing integrity over abuse." A long moment passed. "You're not the victim you think you are," he said. "I was never the victim," I answered. "I was the witness. And now I'm the one with the power to stop what you started." He stared at me with something like disbelief, maybe even fear. "This isn't over," he said. "No," I agreed, "but your control is." He left without another word. I went to my mother's office next. The door creaked softly as I pushed it open. Her plant was still alive. Her framed photo from the community groundbreaking stood beside her old pen cup. It smelled faintly of citrus and the lavender lotion she always used. I moved to her desk slowly, reverently, and sat in her chair. For the first time since she died, I let myself cry quietly, shoulders shaking, tears dripping onto the polished wood. "I did it, Mom," I whispered. "I really did it." When the grief eased and my breath steadied, I noticed the small drawer on the right side of the desk. It was locked. I tried the key I'd used on her safe deposit box. It clicked open. Inside was a single sealed envelope, my name written across the front in her handwriting. "For Ivy, open when ready." I ran my fingers across the ink, my heart thudding. A final secret, a final truth, a final gift. I didn't open it. Not yet. I pressed it gently to my chest, closed the drawer, and whispered into the quiet room, "I'm ready, Mom. Whenever you're ready to tell me." The envelope sat on my lap for a long time before I could bring myself to open it. I was alone in my mother's office, the evening light settling in amber streaks across the floor. The building was quiet, now employees gone home, board members finished with their meetings. The frantic noise of the past week softened into stillness. It felt like the world was holding its breath with me. My fingers finally slipped under the flap. I unfolded the letter slowly, careful with the fragile paper as though it were her hand I might accidentally hurt. "My dearest Ivy, if you're reading this, then you've taken the first steps I hoped for but never dared to expect. I didn't want to leave you with burdens, but I couldn't leave you blind to the truth either. You were the only one I trusted with the future of this family, of this company, of everything your grandfather built. I know this has cost you. I'm sorry. But I need you to know something you never believed about yourself. You were always the strongest one." I bowed my head as tears welled, letting her words seep into all the parts of me I had spent years trying to sew together. "Strength isn't cruelty, Ivy. It's compassion, perseverance, clarity. You carried all three while the rest of us worshipped the wrong things: legacy, profit, pride. I saw your heart breaking in silence at every holiday dinner. I saw you shrink to keep the peace. I'm sorry I let it go on for so long. I should have protected you better. So now, even from here, I will." I pressed my palm to the paper, feeling the weight of her regret, her love, her final promise. "Build a life where you are honored, not tolerated. Set boundaries, not walls, but doors that open only for the people who earn their way in. And please, my sweet girl, don't let your worth be shaped by those who refuse to see it. I loved you first. I love you still. I will love you always, Mom." My vision blurred. I folded the letter against my heart and sat there silently until the gold across the floor faded into dusk. Only when the darkness settled did I stand and leave her office, locking it gently behind me as if sealing a sacred space. The next morning I drove to Willamette Memorial Cemetery with fresh lilies, my mother's favorite. The wind carried the sound of distant traffic and rustling leaves as I approached her grave, the stones still new, the earth still soft around it. I knelt beside her, placing the flowers with a care so deliberate it felt like prayer. "I kept my promise," I whispered. "Your programs are safe. The company is safe. I'm safe." The breeze stirred lightly, brushing against my cheek the way she used to when she tucked my hair behind my ear. I closed my eyes and let myself imagine just for a moment that she was standing beside me. "I didn't know how much you carried," I said. "But I understand now. I understand everything. My grief wasn't sharp anymore. It was gentle, full, deep. The kind that didn't crush but completed." I stayed until the cold began to seep through my coat, then Rose touched the top of her stone and whispered goodbye. But leaving wasn't the end. There were consequences still unfolding across the city. Celeste moved to Bend within a week, apparently, to avoid the toxic media frenzy. Articles circulated about her downfall, former COO placed under investigation. Photos showed her leaving her luxury condo with oversized sunglasses, expression pinched. She refused to answer questions. Damon's law license went under full review, pending multiple counts of professional misconduct. He filed for bankruptcy soon after. The news outlets replayed his bravado from past interviews, contrasting them with his present collapse. Public sympathy was non-existent. Raymond resigned under pressure. A terse press release announced his retirement, but everyone knew the truth. Years of silence, complicity, and entitlement had caught up with him. He rarely left his home now. I didn't celebrate their ruin. It wasn't triumph, I felt it was closure. Their consequences didn't erase the harm they'd done, but they finally faced what they had tried so hard to avoid: accountability. With the dust settling, I returned to the work that mattered. I met with architects to review the redesigns for the Helen Rutherford Community Care Center. I walked the halls of our existing buildings, greeting staff who had once avoided meeting my eyes, but now looked at me with gratitude. I worked with community leaders to reopen programs my siblings tried to suffocate. And with every decision, every plan, every late-night meeting, I felt the presence of my mother guiding me, grounding me, reminding me why she chose me. One afternoon, after approving a new budget that redirected funds from executive bonuses to affordable housing, I walked down the hallway toward my new office, the executive suite my siblings once considered their birthright. Employees greeted me with nods, some with soft smiles. I didn't feel like an outsider anymore. I felt like a leader, a protector, a continuation of everything my mother believed in. But healing didn't come from power. It came from boundaries. Raymond called once asking for a meeting. I agreed, but only in a conference room with a witness present. He tried to appeal to the family name, to unity, to moving forward. But those words had lost their meaning long ago. "I hope you find clarity," I said simply. "But the company doesn't belong to you anymore. And neither does my sense of obligation," he left quietly. And for the first time, I felt free. Weeks passed. The community center's groundbreaking ceremony arrived on a crisp winter afternoon. Hundreds attended families. My mother helped employees she cherished, volunteers she mentored. The governor came, news outlets came. People held signs with my mother's name. When it was my turn to speak, I looked out at the crowd and felt something settle softly in my chest. "This center isn't just a building," I said. "It's a promise. A continuation of a legacy rooted in compassion, dignity, and justice." My mother believed community wasn't a burden, it was the heart of everything we do. And now it will define the future. Applause rippled across the field. Some people cried. I did too. After the ceremony, a young woman approached me. She couldn't have been older than 25. "Your mother helped my family when we had nowhere else to go," she said. "And you're helping other people now. I just wanted to say thank you." Her words settled into me like warmth. That night I sat on my balcony at home, the city lights blinking softly in the distance. I held my mother's letter one more time, reading the lines I already knew by heart. I thought about everything I'd lost, and everything I'd gained. I thought about the family I was born into, broken, grasping, hollow, and the family I had chosen, people of integrity, kindness, steadfast loyalty. I thought about the version of myself who once begged for a seat at a table that never needed me, and the woman I had become, a leader who didn't need their approval because I finally understood my worth came from the one person who never doubted it. My mother. If you've ever been excluded by your own family or made to believe you were less than you truly are, I want you to hear this. Your worth has never depended on their recognition, and your life doesn't begin when they finally see you. It begins the moment you see yourself. If this story touched something in you, share your experience in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you were watching along, please like and subscribe. There are more stories of justice, healing, and strength ahead. Before you go, tell me, where are you watching from today?